Hi, this is Ed from Exotic Planks, welcoming you to another video. We're going to call this one Introducing the Steampunk Blanks and kind of reviewing what you need to know in order to do blanks that are polyresin. They do not turn like Alumilite, but they certainly are able to be made into great pens if you exercise a little caution and have a few turning skills. So we're going to go through this and talk about some of the things that you can do if you run into difficulties turning the polyresin blank. To make this video, I selected one of the blanks that we had from MIK, our new artist from Australia, who makes these steampunk blanks. And the one that I selected was one that was not selected by anybody else, so you could call it the Ugly Duckling. And we took that one and started working with it. I selected the Sierra. And this chart shows why I selected the Sierra. The amount that is left on the Sierra is the smallest amount of any single tube that I could think of. So I figured if you can make the Sierra, you ought to be able to make anything. So why not take the one that is the most challenging, and anything after that should be simpler. So let's get into it, and thank you for watching. So I begin by mounting the blank onto the lathe on a mandrel. I still use a mandrel. I like mandrels. And as you can see, as I try to slip it over the bushing, it doesn't fit particularly well. So we look at the inside of this and find that the inside does have something in it. It may be glue, it may be polyresin. I don't know what it is, but I know it's not supposed to be there. So the first thing I do is try to take it off with a file. And you can see the glue in there now. If you look at it just right, you can see the glue has actually gotten discolored from the file, and therefore you can see what you're trying to do. You're trying to eliminate that. Now I then take a small pocket knife, which I work with until I get that glue. Actually, it's probably polyresin because there's no glue that should have been involved in this. But the polyresin has to be stripped out of that tube. In order for everything to fit right, that's one of the first steps that you have to do. So that's what I'm doing there, and as you'll see shortly, I slip it back over, or slip a bushing into it. It fits fine, so then we go back to putting it on the mandrel with both sides fitting fine into the tube. Then, of course, it's just a matter of screwing it on. I will say that I am not a fan of these D-shaped blanks. By the same token, they can be turned. They just create a couple more challenges. One of the things that I suggest frequently is that you take them and take off the D shape with a belt sander prior to trying to turn it. If you do that, then the D shape turns into a regular circular blank, and it's a little bit simpler. But I wanted to face every problem that could possibly be out there so that we can show that there's nothing you can't overcome. It's not difficult to make pens out of these. If you've watched a number of my videos, you realize that I normally start on the corners of a blank, but I normally start by turning from the inside out, that is from the material, the center of the material, to the outside corner. I am doing it reverse for this material, because someone told me that they are chipping it out when they're coming from the inside out. So if that's the case, if you know you're working with something that may be a little chippy, then work from the outside in. A friend of mine one time told me that way you know that the material on the inside is supporting the cut. Makes an awful lot of sense. If you push the material from the outside off the blank into the blank, you are pushing into more material. You are far less likely to chip out. So that's the method that I'm using here because it's safer. As I continued to turn this, I became less and less worried about breaking it. As I say, I had somebody told me that it was somewhat difficult, and so I was concerned going in. As you can see, I'm getting off ribbons completely. I'm having no problem at all with the material. The turning of it was not difficult. Yes, it is a polyresin, and if you are spoiled by Alumilite and the only thing you can turn is Alumilite, God bless you. But if you want to improve your skills, you are going to have to try to turn some things that are more difficult, and this is a little more difficult than an Illuminate. As you can see, I'm now down to the point where it's almost round. You can actually see the name, the Sierra, is on the bottom of the tube, because that's also on the bottom of the mold, so they can tell which one they're using, but it does leave a mark on the bottom of the pen blank. Doesn't get in your way because you're going to turn it significantly thinner than that anyhow. But what I'm doing here basically is just continuing to turn normal. It's a simple blank, and as you can see, I did chip it out a little bit. I tried to chip it out a little bit just so that you could see what happens. Once you've got that, it's just a matter of going back over it a couple of times and clearing it up. Now, if you had that chip out coming from the middle of the blank to the outside of the blank and you chipped off a corner, it could indeed get to the point where you were not able to use that blank anymore. One of the things that I have come to realize about turning these blanks that can be a little more challenging, okay, suppose you don't get 100% of them to work. If you are charging enough for the pen, you're charging for your expertise. If you can turn it and other people can't, you are worth more than the average turner. If you can't turn it, then don't try. If you don't want to get any better at it, no problem at all. Just decide that you're going to turn nothing but commercial acrylics and Illuminate, and that's fine. There are people out there who just need those materials, and those of us who can turn other things will still be able to produce pens that you can't make. That's okay. So that's how this is transpired. As you can see now, I'm showing the ends of it are not faced. If you look at this close-up, you can see there's a line of tack heads that's actually the end of the blank, and then there's some clear resin after that. That's what I have to face off, and that's what I will be doing next with my sandpaper facing device. Facing this accurately is kind of important. You want to get down to the point where you're just touching the brass tube. So I take a fair amount of time to do this. I'll make it quick in the video, but I was pretty careful to make sure that I was right at the end of the tube and not beyond it, because those tacks are very close. The tack heads are very close to the edge of the blank, and you want to keep those so that it looks cool. So be kind of careful when you face it. Just pay attention to what you're doing, and it's really not very difficult. Here you can see that that's what it looks like. There's a little bit of a shine coming off of the brass. I just touched the brass, and it is just shining a little bit, so that we definitely will put the components of the pen into the brass. It'll touch the brass. It won't put pressure on the outside of the blank. That's all there is to it. We move on from there into putting it together and buffing it. As we continue with this, you can see that I've got it back on the lathe, and I am going to have to get it down to the actual diameter that I want now. This is a matter of taking off a little bit more material and getting it right down to the bushings. So that's what's going to happen during this section. I switched to a different skew. This one is a little smaller tool. It's also sharp. I had a couple of ideas that I was going to try if I had any problems, but honestly I had no problems, so I didn't have to try them. One of the things that I did not mention in the other half of this is, if you're running into problems and if you can't seem to get it to come off the way you want it to, you can always revert to sandpaper. Realize that if you are this close down and you're afraid that you're going to go through or going to hit the material that's underneath there, if you take a 240 grit, anything between a 240 and a 360, you're going to be able to take off the material and still get to a point where you can fairly easily make it into a nice looking pen. You're not going to get deep scratches from the 240 to a 360 anywhere in there. So if you don't have the tool control to be able to do what I'm doing, and it's only taken me 20 years to get to do that, so it would make some sense that you don't. That's not something to be embarrassed about, but by the same token, the more times that you blow one up, the more you learn about it. And I blew up a heck of a lot of blanks before I got to the level that I'm at now. So it's what you call a cost of education. If you always think you're going to get a blank to turn, you'll never get any better. So it's up to you how you do it. At any rate, now we're getting down to where it's at a finished size. Both ends are at the level just about that they need to be. As you can see, I am going very gingerly, but I'm also taking off ribbons. One thing that can happen in this situation is if you're trying to go turn between centers, or if your mandrel is not exactly straight, you can end up trying to turn off material, more material on one part of the blank than on the other. In other words, if it's not mounted in there square, you can end up turning off material unevenly, and that will indeed blow up the blank. So, you know, it's not always your fault if your equipment is not set up to be accurate. It doesn't matter how good you are, the equipment is fighting against you, and you'll never be great. So be aware of anything that feels like vibration. You should be able to stop your lathe anytime you want to, turn that blank a quarter turn, and then go back to working on it, and it should not change. It should still be as round as it was before. If it's not, something that you're doing, something that your equipment is doing, is not keeping that dead square. And if it's not dead square, you will have problems with these things where you have, you know, the thickness of this is 10 sheets of paper. So if you turn it perfectly, your thickness from your brass tube to the finished diameter is 10 sheets of paper. You have something underneath there that the artist put in there that's going to be at least 4 or 5 sheets of paper. So when you come down to what do you have to work with, no, there's not a lot there. And if you're not careful, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that you're going to blow it up. So try to be careful. What I'm doing now is taking 400 grit, and that I can tell because it's 1 inch wide, and that's my new method of telling what I'm doing. Next will be the 600 grit, and then we will go from here into buffing it and making it into a pen. I always enjoy turning pens, pretty much any kind of pen, but particularly enjoy it when it's something that I never really thought much of. I've not been a fan of Steampunk, and after I looked at this one and I realized that it's one that we had left because everybody else passed by it, when you go to the buffer and you do the Tripoli, it immediately turns into just a beautiful piece of work. And I have to say that the workmanship that these guys are doing, in this case that MIK's doing, just phenomenal. It really is nice looking work. So yeah, it's worth the trouble. These are not that difficult to turn, but yes, they are more difficult than Alumilite. And I'm afraid that we as a group have become so spoiled by the easy stuff that you can't turn anything that's a little bit challenging anymore. So give it a try, and good luck to you, and I hope that you make excellent pens out of it. Just to comment on this, I had just charged the Tripoli and White Diamond, so it really went very fast. This is real time. And then that last wheel on the right has actually got nothing on it anymore, but it kind of takes off any dust, and so that's the reason that I put it across that wheel a couple of times. That's all there is to it. Again, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you'll try this material. I think you'll find out that they are beautiful blanks, but yes, you may blow 1 or 2 up, and if you do, remember to price it into the other ones that you succeed on. These can be $100 pens without any trouble at all. Again, this is Ed from Exotic Blanks. Bye now. Thanks for watching.